Creating Conversations with our conversation tonight with Naomi Hirahara and Susan Kamei. We are so delighted that you could join us tonight. We are excited to be offering this program. My name's Mary Elizabeth Giraldi, and I am the events maven here with Creating Conversations, which is located in Redondo Beach. So I'm going to introduce Naomi and Susan. So Naomi Hirahara is the Edgar Award-winning author of the Masarai Mystery Series, the LA-based Ellie Rush Mysteries, and the Lelani Santiago Hawaii Mysteries. And Eternal Lay, the next book in that series, releases in March 2022. A former newspaper editor, Naomi has co-written nonfiction books like Life After Manzanar and the award-winning Terminal Island, Lost Communities of Los Angeles Harbor. The Stanford University alumna was born and raised in Altadena. She now resides in the adjacent town of Pasadena. Tonight's focus is on her new historical crime novel, Clark and Division, set in 1994 Chicago. It has received acclaim as an Indie Next pick, praise from George Takei, and is a staff pick by yours truly. Welcome, Naomi. Susan Kamei is the granddaughter of Japanese immigrants. Her maternal grandparents were part of the Japanese classical music community in Los Angeles's Little Tokyo, and her paternal grandparents were vegetable farmers in Orange County. During World War II, her mother and her parents were incarcerated at the Santa Anita Assembly Center in Arcadia, California, and at the War Relocation Authority camp in Heart Mountain, Wyoming. Her father, together with his grandparents, parents, and siblings, was detained at the War Relocation Authority camp known as Poston II in Arizona. Susan received her JD from the Georgetown University Law Center. She teaches at the University of Southern California on the legal ramifications of the incarcerations of persons of Japanese ancestry during World War II and how they apply to constitutional issues, civil liberties, and national security considerations today. Her new book releases soon on September 7th. When Can We Go Back to America? Voices of Japanese American Incarceration During World War II is intended for middle grade readers and up. Publishers Weekly called it a truly remarkable, comprehensible resource with an emphasis on allyship, indispensable for researchers and any resistor of injustice. So welcome, Susan. So let's talk about American history. I mean, we're talking about Japanese American history, but really it's American history. So two slightly different takes on it in the instance of your most recent books, one fictional, one not. But Naomi, do you want to start with, what brought you to look at 1944 and how much some of that is resonant today?
Sure. So it's kind of interesting. Actually, as Susan and I chatted yesterday about what we we're going to talk about today. And I think our personal histories are different because neither one of my parents were in camp. And it seems like we have a lot of people here who have ties to the camp experience. And usually when Japanese Americans come together, we call the detention, we just say camp, but we all know it's not summer camp, right? So everybody's in agreement there. So my father was born here, but was raised in Japan, and my mother is an immigrant in Japan. So they were in Hiroshima during World War II. So the way that I really deepened my knowledge about this was my work at the newspaper, the Rafu Shimpo. It's a Japanese American daily newspaper established from 1903. So that was in the 80s and 90s. So that was the height of the redress and reparations movement to address what had happened in terms of the incarceration of Japanese Americans during the war. So, the English section was created by the Nisei, for the Nisei, written by the Nisei. And this was, many decades later, and we still had the same mission. And I think it was important because, of course, that era, that was a watershed um, experience for people of Japanese ancestry. So, and, of course, we see, from anti-Asian violence that's been sparked during the pandemic to immigrants, being barred from coming into the country. There's so many parallels. Unfortunately, probably, we thought maybe we had, dealt with this, but it keeps coming. And unfortunately, I think both of our projects have a lot of resonance today. But yeah, so Susan, we heard a little bit about your family's experience during World War II. When did you first hear about your family's experience?
Sure. Well, hello, everyone. And it's really my honor and thrill to get to do this conversation with Naomi. I've been such a fangirl from the time she was at the RAFU, and we know so many people in common and share so much together in the community. So I'm so excited about her book and this chance to talk tonight. The experience that I had about learning about my parents and my grandparents' camp experience is probably pretty typical of other Sansei or third generation, in that they didn't talk about it much at all. Little references would dribble out, say for instance from my mother about my grandfather's trunk. She said just in passing one day that he stored some of our belongings there in that trunk at one of the Buddhist temples while they were at camp. I remember her telling me one day that about the icicles in her hair when she had to walk back and forth from Heart Mountain, that it was so cold that the minute she got out of a shower, she would walk back with her head full of these icicles, and little things like that. But it wasn't until redress, when my father was very involved in every possible Japanese American civic organization in Orange County. He was a 3-time chapter president of the Salonica chapter of JCL. And I was just growing up listening to him talk about the issues that were going on in the various organizations. And I was in high school, college, when redress, that Naomi's already mentioned, started taking traction. And that's when he started talking to me more about what it meant to his family. They were farmers and they lost everything when they went to camp, and they came back and tried to reestablish themselves. And it was one day when I was in college when he took me aside and said how hard it was, how they didn't have any legal resources. They couldn't afford one even if they knew how to get that. And he said, we needed a lawyer in the family, and you could be that lawyer. I was able then to be active in with the redress volunteering, because I was in law school in Washington, D.C. And it was really through the redress process that I heard much more from my parents, much more from the other Nisei leaders. And that probably distinguishes my relationship with their experience than, say, from my brothers, because otherwise they didn't get to hear what I got to hear.
And let's talk a little bit about Susan's book. Look at this big fat book. It's just so gorgeous, so poignant. And this is I'm sorry to bring this up, but this is a very affordable book, because when I first looked at it, it's going, this has got to be about $100, but it's about 20, let's see, it's $23, which is a wonderful resource. And in it, what Susan has interlaced all of these personal stories of people like I remember from Rafu Shimpo, and actually one of the individuals kind of inspired a part of the Clarkin Division story. But Susan, can you just tell us, this is published by Simon and Schuster, can you just tell us how this whole project evolved, and kind of the scope of it as well.
Sure. Well, it was a great opportunity for a publisher such as Simon Schuster to really believe in the concept of this book. And my goal was that it would tell in an accessible way the complete story. So often what is in textbooks or in an encyclopedia or some kind of entry for students would be Pearl Harbor's bombed, and there was this thing that was called a detention camp, and then the war ended, and it's as if that was the story, and it in my opinion has played into the false government narrative that, oh, you have to understand, we were at war, Pearl Harbor was we had to react to things that were threats to our national security, and that it was important to me that in a flashback, in a series of flashbacks for the beginning of the book, that readers would understand the Issei experience, and that from the time they first came to the United States, starting in the 1880s, they stepped into an environment that was anti-Asian because of what had happened with the Chinese laborers and what resulted in the Chinese Exclusion Acts, and that other factors through the turn of the century, World War I, and leading up to the pre-World War II time, that there were many factors that were strikes against persons of Japanese ancestry, if you will. So Pearl Harbor gave a lot of political cover, and it certainly inflamed the fear in the country about anyone who looked different, who looked like the enemy. But it wasn't anti-Japanese and anti-Asian policies and social environment didn't start with Pearl Harbor. On the other end of the story, and this is where your book, Naomi, really plays an important part, is that the legacy of the trauma of the experience didn't end when they left camp. They didn't go back to a happy life. And in fact, what we now are learning more about is the long-term, the intergenerational aspects of the incarceration. And above all, that it's about the personal experience. And what I came to realize is that if there were 120,000 individuals approximately that experienced the detention, there were 120,000 different stories. And this was a way to tell some of them, and to have readers appreciate that everyone had to reconcile and figure out how they were going to deal with this in their own way. So some of the stories reflect different kinds of reactions to what they were experiencing and how they handled it.
Yeah, for me, I mean, if you see like a regular masterpiece mystery on Sunday, nights, the show starts with the crime, and of course with someone, a dead body. In Clark and Division, there's also different levels of criminal activity. There's state crimes, and of course there is something suspicious. My stories follows a family, the Ito family, and it's also a story about two sisters. And we talked about this earlier, like the Ne-chan, or the older sister, Rose. And actually the story is told from the little sister's perspective, Aki, and she, adores her sister. They go from Tropical, a place in Los Angeles, to Manzanar, and Rose is released early to Chicago, and Aki and her parents follow, only to find out something terrible has happened. And it's up to Aki to kind of figure out the truth, as well as to carry her parents through this traumatic experience. And for me, I did talk to my editor. It's like, well, should we just start it right at Chicago, when it becomes clear that something terrible has happened? Or, the way I had it originally is how it's published. I start off when Aki's birth in Tropical. And I think part of it is, so many people just look at someone who looks like us and say, well, where were you born? Where were you from? And it's like, okay, folks, you are witnessing her birth in Los Angeles. So, and you know, so there's little scenes of just like growing up in a mostly white area, the kind of microaggressions and, you know, racism that Aki has to deal with. And I think it's precisely what you were mentioning, Susan, that I didn't want to just say, okay, you know, it's Pearl Harbor, and then all the stuff just happened as a result of Pearl Harbor. It was like things that were happening before. Children were not allowed to swim in public pools. I mean, that people of color were like, and Blacks and Japanese people were not allowed to swim in public pools with white children at the same time. You know, it was like right before the pool was to be cleaned, then okay, you can go inside the pool, the water. So it's just, yeah, I was trying to gently kind of weave in, because it's hard for us in the 21st century to really imagine, you know, like our parents, if they're immigrants, they could not be citizens. You know, there's like basic things I think we take for granted today. So I kind of wanted to take the reader through, you know, some of these experiences many of us are very familiar with, but I figured with a mystery, you get all sorts of readers, and some people might not know, you know.
Yeah, yeah. No, and I think you crammed so much into with the details, so much of that historical education in terms of the way the Issei and the Nisei talked. Some of the words that I grew up hearing and are just so they're just so symbolic of what I think of my grandparents and my parents. High tone and the dance at Nishi, and everybody in Little Tokyo would know what Nishi represented, and so it was really fun to see those words and realize how much you were sharing about the history.
Susan, can you explain more how this book is organized and why you decided, what sort of considerations did you have in terms of the organizing the names and the people and the interviews and the quotes and all those kind of things?
Sure. So one consideration that I had, well, most of the research for the book came about from the course that I teach at USC, and having packaged together the material and already having gone through the exercise of explaining it to others and to start to pull together the links to primary documents and creating that sense of personal connection with excerpts from oral histories and interviews, say from the Densho collection, from the various veterans organizations that did oral histories, over the last 20, 30 years or so. So lots of different kinds of ways to weave in those stories. And so also thinking of it as a teaching resource, what kind of materials and what kind of approaches would be useful for teachers. And so that was a great motivation for the poetry, as not only to show some of the perspectives of the people. So my parents were the exact generation that we were trying to talk across time to. They were freshmen in high school when Pearl Harbor was bombed, and they graduated from high school in camp. So the idea was to have the young people of the wartime talk about, have their voices talking to young people today. The support from Simon & Schuster to have as complete as bios as we were able to research was to have the people feel real and to give the context to their quotes. So much of the material, if they were already known public figures, such as a Norman Netto or a George Takei, came from families, and what the families shared with us, or what we were able to, and amplified with what we were able to find online. So the back half of the book, the narrative is the front half, and teaching resources, a glossary, timeline, lists of the camps, information about the populations there, that sort of thing, are what are constituting the second half of the book. So as I told my mother-in-law, she said, "Oh, do I have to read the whole thing?" And I said, "No, you only have to read the front part."
Well, one of the people you mentioned, and I was delighted to see her name, was Sue Kunitomi Embry. And she informed Clark and Division. She's one of the people I dedicated the book to. And, most of us are familiar with her. She grew up in Los Angeles, was in Manzanar. She was released in the Wisconsin, and then she eventually went to Chicago, where she worked at a place called the Newberry Library. So the way I was, I had to do research because there's not that much written about Japanese Americans going to Chicago. Although if you're in the community, you know somebody who was born there or their parents lived there for a short period of time. But before World War II, there were 400 Japanese Americans, and by the mid 40s, there are 20,000. And most of them were like, you're talking about young people. Most of them, their average age was their mid 20s. So, I had to go to Chicago, and I had a guide, Eric Matsunaga, and also Bob Kumaki, native Chicagoans, who were so kind. And there's not, so Susan and I were also talking about community, and unfortunately in Chicago, there was a lot of erasure. So the government had said, don't, congregate in numbers 3 or more. Of course people did in terms of where they lived or where they worked, but it was just like this message: do not build a community center. There were some Buddhist temples and some Christian churches, but other than that, there really isn't a place that remains that people like, in California will go to Little Tokyo, or in San Francisco, San Jose, there's places, touchstones that we have. So so I think that was another motivation for writing. People say, well, why are you writing a mystery? Why not fiction? And I think there's so many gaps. I was able to find reports that unfortunately there was a lot of delinquency that happened. And I think that's referring to the trauma you were talking about, Susan. And so I was going, well, I want to humanize our people, and if you're going to be ripped from your homes and lose everything, then stuck in a camp in a desert or in a swampland, and then you're all of a sudden in a notorious town. Yeah. And you're 20 years old, 20 something, you're going to get it. Some people are going to get in trouble. And so that's why I chose the vehicle of a mystery. But Susan, you have an interesting story related to Chicago.
Yeah. So as you heard my parents' story, they came back to Southern California. And in fact, my mother and her parents came from before the war. They were in Little Tokyo, and then afterwards they came here to Pasadena, which explains some of my own Pasadena roots. So it's because of a salad dressing recipe. So what I was telling Naomi about was my mother was a very fine cook in her day, and there would be these special occasions when they would invite Caucasian friends, Hagujin friends over for dinner, and she would take great care to come up with a non-Japanese meal. This is 1960s. And there was this salad dressing that she only made for this special company. She never made it for us as a family. And so in my childhood mind, I elevated this salad dressing to this mythic importance. And at one point, I think it was about 10, I had an index card, and I was asking her, well, what's in this recipe, and how do you make it? And she was explaining, it was a French, it was a dressed up French dressing. And she said, oh, but what makes it special is a little bit of grated onion and some chopped celery and chopped bell pepper. She said that was very important, and grated hard-boiled egg. So I wrote this all down, and then I said, okay, so what do you call this? And she said, oh, I got the recipe from my girlfriends. They called it Edgewater beach dressing. So I wrote it down. I'm thinking beach, there must be a beach somewhere. I said, oh, is this Hawaii? And my mother goes, no, these girls went from Hawaii. So, you know, she didn't know. And all these years, the recipe card is still in my recipe box. And it was just within the last, year or so. And I was working on material for the class, working on closing out research for the book. And I came across an oral history, and she was talking about how she was one of these Edgewater Beach Hotel salad girls. And it was the Edgewater Beach Hotel in Chicago. And I start Googling, and it was a big convention hotel. And they hired lots of Nisei young women out of camp to be on this production line of pushing out hundreds, thousands of salads for the convention lunches and dinner. And I went,
I love that. I have to make that and tell everyone it's the Edgewater.
that was at least her
Beach.
version.
Yeah. Well, and this topic of erasure too. I mean, you had some, as a person who studies these kind of things and speaks on it, I think you were looking at other communities where there's been like an erasure of our history.
Yeah, so I think this is an interesting way to look at the kind of transitions that our respective communities have gone through. You have the Little Tokyo example where some people did come back and had the transition from the Black community that had moved in while folks were at camp, and then just a lot of community transition between them returning and what was happening to the Black community I call Little Tokyo Bronzeville, and to what Little Tokyo has become over the years. In contrast with a community such as Tacoma, I'm working with some researchers at University of Washington, Tacoma, that have documented how the pre-war community, especially from the Nisei perspective, being students at the Japanese language school there, after the war never got reconstituted. And so people didn't come back. So I think Chicago's an interesting comparison because there were so few before the war. And then namely what you were sharing about them then not having any existing urban fabric that represents the community that was there. Even though there's a number of Japanese Americans that continue to live in Chicago. I think I really appreciate all the focus on the resettlement process that Clark and Division brings up, because I didn't really understand when I was growing up why so many of my parents' Nisei friends that went to professional schools that finished their education in dental schools or medical school or whatever, that they had degrees from all these Midwestern universities, right? And so it's just my understanding this migration pattern explains a lot. And I think what was really interesting for me in reading the character backgrounds in your book, that people had come from so many different camps.
Yeah, and what's interesting is how what camp a certain person had been in. Like, for instance, there's two Buddhist temples, two main Buddhist temples in Chicago, and they were from different camps. One was from Heart Mountain, can't remember the other one, but it seems like some of their camp congregants followed them to Chicago and then attended their temple. And then another thing is, so Clark and Division, it's an intersection in Chicago, and it was a way station. It was like the first place that people went through They lived in boarding houses or apartment buildings, but and then on the north side of the intersection it was a pretty shady kind of, there was some gambling operations, there was kind of a red light district. So that's what Aki's kind of, on one hand is this beautiful Newberry Library, which, I was able to take a tour of when Eric Matsunaga was taking me around Clarkin Division. And I didn't realize, you probably know better than I do, that I didn't know that the Newberry was this really elite like reference library. I thought, oh, it's just a library. And it was like, whoa,
Very
it's
grand,
yeah, yeah. And then I was just imagining Sue like going from Manzanar, right? Like the dust of Manzanar, to trying to make her way to Chicago, and then suddenly working at this place, and with beautiful tile floors, and just I recently touched base with her son because I wanted to make sure he got a book, and he said, yeah, his mother would talk about, how beautiful that place was. So
one of the quotes that I have of Sue in the book is she's recounting how she's having this conversation with her mother in camp, how her mother is afraid for her to leave camp. And she's saying, well, yeah, I just got to go. And she was going to go meet some girlfriends that she knew from camp that had already gone to Chicago. And it's just the bravery that they had, just as really sticks with me.
Yeah, it was, well, what was a challenge for me, because if we know, and I've always wanted to write a book from a Nisei woman's point of view, but my own mother actually is an immigrant, right? So I was not raised by Nisei mother. So, so that part I had to, and working at the Rafu Shimpa, I would deal with Nisei women all the time, and, very straightforward, a lot of them are very straightforward and tell me what's what and all this. But I knew that it couldn't have been easy. And another thing I wanted to kind of address is the War Relocation Authority photos. All of them, like these, especially the women, well, the men too, they're immaculate, right? They're
all dressed up.
Just
Yeah.
so. And I think people could get the idea by looking at those, like, oh, camp wasn't, these detention centers weren't that bad. Look at them. They look good. They're smiling. And I was going, and I know someone on this Zoom is Janice Tanaka, and she was able to provide me with the zoot suit photos, the Boyle Heights guys in zoot suits, and that inspired one of my characters, Hammer Ishimine. But yeah, that, those smiles can be very deceiving, and that there's more stuff underneath. So even my editor had to kind of push me, because she wanted to understand. I mean, you don't want to just, with fiction, you don't want to just, I'm trying to be didactic and I'm trying to explain this. It has to be more organic. But I did need to dig deeper. And I think because I am kind of a Nisei in a weird way, I'm raised by an immigrant, a Japanese immigrant mother. In that way, I think I connected to Aki, and just the sense that I sometimes, although my mom's smart as a whip, but I know growing up, there's been times like I felt very protective of my mother, and I felt like I was interpreting the world for my mother. And I'm sure, like, for these folks going through such chaos, and many times the patriarch was taken away, right? So it's just the Issei mother with her Nisei kids. So, I mean, what were these stories that came out in your work as well, in terms of the family?
Very much so. So to the point of the Nisei children doing things for their Issei parents, I made the point of, I had a conference in Washington, D.C. a couple of years ago, pre-COVID, and had enough advance notice that I planned ahead to spend a couple days at the National Archives. and got up to speed on how to request my parents, my grandparents, and aunts and uncles, and to the extent I had time, some of the spouses of my aunts and uncles, and look at their War Relocation Authority files. And it was one of the most amazing and moving and in some ways traumatic experiences of my life, just to see what was contained in their files, and to process what the information was that was in their files. And one of the things that really struck me is that they just had to fill out questionnaire after questionnaire after questionnaire after form after form after form. And they're all, especially for each of them, in my mother's case, for herself as well as for each of her parents. And so in the forms in my grandparents' files, it's all filled out in my mother's handwriting.
Mm.
And so I knew that she was always serving as Aki did in this translator role, both not only of English but of culture and of relationships outside the family, and just seeing my mother's handwriting on all of those forms just really made that come home to me.
Mm. Wow, that must have been
that role of the
something
DC.
else.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm wondering if I know. Oh, it's our host. Hello,
We could
Mary
keep going.
Elizabeth.
Absolutely. I just want to encourage people who may have questions for either of our authors to feel free to either drop them in chat or to use the reaction button to raise your hand. Although in all honesty, chat will be easier because I have to scroll between 2 pages of attendees to see the raised hand. I also, despite my trying to be careful, apologize. I did not say Kamei correctly earlier, and names are important, and I want to take the opportunity to correct myself. So just to go a little more on what you've already been speaking about, for me, I actually thought as a West Coast raised person, I kind of knew about this, right? I actually grew up in Southern Oregon, which means I was only about an hour or so from Tule Lake. But both of you spoke to this a little, that it's so, in the past, it's been touched on so briefly in history. And I had these just sort of absurd ideas like, well, people were sent to the camps, but then they just went back home to Los Angeles, right? I didn't understand that process. And so, but I loved what you said, Naomi, which was like, here's someone who's never been in Chicago before, and we all know what kind of town that is. And so of course she's going to get in trouble. So it was, but you're going to do more with this character, but you're going to bring her back home. Is that correct?
I am when I first wrote Clark and Division, it was just a standalone. I've written mostly series. So it's like, and also I do not live in Chicago. My parents were not, did not live in Chicago. So it's a lot of stress to write this kind of book, because I'm dealing with history from the 30s, then camp stuff, and then Chicago, and and just trying to, there's all these plates that I'm trying to keep spinning, and I want it to be spinning correctly. And I knew that I could do like a sliver of time in 1944 in Chicago, because a lot of people don't know about this time, so a lot of it has to be kind of pieced together and imagined in some ways. But if I kept writing about Chicago, I know the native Chicago, or the people who've lived in Chicago for years, would really call me on it. And so I'm just making way. I know there's going to be some other wonderful stories about Chicago, but I'm going to step back and let other people, more qualified than me to tell that story. But Soho Crime, they wanted a follow-up. And then I said, okay. And so the next one, there's only going to be one other book with these characters, and it's called Evergreen. So for those of you who know Boyle Heights, you know, Evergreen Cemetery, Evergreen Hostel, there was Evergreen Baptist Church. So it's going to be set in Los Angeles, and I'm doing
Oh,
some
yay.
heavy duty research right now. It's really, and again, it's going to be about a very specific time. It looks like I'm going to do 1946. Yeah. And that's when a lot of these businesses were, you know, even I'm going to integrate where I worked, Rafu Shimpo, in there, because I know a lot of the history already, and it came back in 1946. So
Will Soho do another lovely map for you?
yes, I know the map is so lovely. And Eric Matsunaga, he just checked all the locations, but yeah, they hired a designer and it's so beautiful. I just love, this is my first official hardback book. I mean, like one Masarai was in hardback, but I don't really count that. But this is, Soho did a really beautiful job, and I'm very happy. Yeah.
Yeah, my family is buried in Evergreen Cemetery, and my grandmother was part of Evergreen Baptist.
So it's really, I spoke, I had one in-person event last in Oakland, and it was really nice. People had already read the book, and they put a little dot where their family had been, or, you know, or at least showed me, you know, my parents were here. So I think, you know, again, this is a back to the erasure or reclaiming our space. So that's why I love the map.
Susan, I anticipate that you'll probably have a lot of encounters like that when you're able to interact with people as well. You spoke with more than 100 families when working on When Can We Go Back to America, correct?
Yeah, and people are, it's such a small world, and people are related by marriage, and there's all these stories of who knew whom from when, and but of course there's so many more stories that are still out there to be discovered and told.
And I like how you with each name, the last name, the surname, you put it in bold, right?
Yeah,
Susan?
so that was an editorial decision, because for some, they were known by their a maiden name, and if they were a married woman, and others they were known by their married name, and some who were writers or professional women, even of that era, they were known by whatever name they used professionally. And then one of the questions that we got that bubbled up in the editorial process was that non-Japanese readers would not necessarily be familiar with the Japanese names. And so to know, so even for Nisei that had Japanese first names, they would not necessarily know whether it was a name that was identified with being male or a name that was identified with being female. And so so those are some of the reasons why the identifying lines became what they are.
And I have a Susan specific question, then I have a couple of questions that are addressed to both of you. So Nancy wants to say that she loves the title of When Can We Go Back to America? And she wants to know the source of that title.
Thank you. That's a great question, and it's actually something that we tried to explain in the book flap. There was a story that circulated in the camps. Sometimes it was about a child that was a boy, and sometimes it was about a child that was a girl. I chose to make it a girl. And the story that got repeated, and was even, you can see it in some of the camp newsletters, is that when they got to camp, you know, for the most part, they were minorities in their local communities. And what was a shock to get to camp is to see, or the assembly center, and then the relocation authority camps, was to all of a sudden be in an environment where all the faces were Japanese. And so the story is that this young child looks around and mistakenly thinks that her parents have taken her to Japan. And she says to her mother, Mommy, I don't like it here. When can we go home? When can we go back to America? And to me, there was this symbolic element to that question, because 2/3 of those who had been incarcerated were the Nisei American-born citizens, and that this experience had denied them of their constitutional rights of being treated as American citizens. And so when can they go back to the America that in which their citizenship was recognized and the rights of their citizenship were upheld? And so that's the story, and that's the meaning of the title.
That's very moving and kind of heartbreaking. So hopefully this will be a slightly easier question from Arlene for both of you. Arlene says hello and would like to know what you like best and what you like least about being a writer.
You know, I think I may have an atypical answer, but I think I like writing stories because I like connecting with people. Yeah, so it's kind of, it's not like I'm a poet and I'm trying to express my inner thoughts, but it's more, I think that's why I gravitate towards some of these hidden stories, because I just like that example I just told you, when someone takes a book and looks at a map and reads the story and can kind of make a connection to their own family history, which is not really that known to them, and somehow there's sparks, you know, something, you know, coalesces, and that to me is very, yeah, satisfying. How about you, Susan?
Well, I do this on this. I have a more than full-time day job, and so my day profession is not directly as a writer. I obviously I do a lot of writing in what I do. So both teaching the course and the production of this book are the late at night, early in the morning, weekend, and whatever vacation time I steal on kind of projects. And so so for me, the opportunity to do this kind of thinking and research and writing is a hobby, is something that I get to do not as the day job. So I do enjoy trying to conceptualize and try to share concepts with others. I think one of the contributions I hope the book makes, especially about the Supreme Court cases and understanding what went on there, was to take information that thus far has only existed in very specialized and arcane legalese, and try to make it somewhat more accessible. And so I enjoy that process. I think I discovered that I must be part detective, because as I was using the secondary sources, I felt, and there's many fine books out there. There's all kinds of years of scholarship that's been done, and yet looking at the secondary sources, I felt a responsibility to check those footnotes, check the references. And then in a lot of cases, it was a game of historic telephone, because that book would cite something, I'd look at that, and that book would cite something, and I'd look at that, and until I got to either the author's original resource, and then I just had to trust them, or to a primary document. And then I would hunt for the primary document. If it's a newspaper article, or say it was a statement in a congressional record by one of the legislators, or it was a statement that was made by a witness in the Congressional Commission hearings. And in many cases, it was a happy result. of being able to confirm that, yes, this was, and then I could just cite to the primary source. In a few breathtakingly scary results, it was wrong. And then was really glad that I checked. And so one example was it was a great quote that had been published in a couple other books that would have been great to have included, but there was something about the timing and what I knew about that person's life that didn't quite add up to me. And the only way to check was, it was a statement from the San Francisco Commission hearings. And the only way to check, and this is COVID, was to, they're not digitized. The transcripts are not digitized, at least from San Francisco. And I'm going, And so I emailed Kristen Hayashi at the museum, at the Japanese American National Museum, on the curatorial team, and said, I'm counting on you guys having the transcripts from the San Francisco hearing. Any chance? I'm looking for this one. And she was really great. And she said, oh, the next time one of my staff goes into the museum, we'll pull it for you. Bless their hearts, they PDF'd it to me. And there was nothing in that, in her, either her oral statement or her written statement that matched up. It was a great quote, but I don't know who it was by. So I think the gratification that to take that kind of historical research seriously, the way it deserves to be, is something that I learned about myself.
I think for me, in terms of the thing I don't like is like self-doubt. And what we do is so public and it's open to criticism. And, I'm so glad that I have a journalistic background, because, people were calling me, yelling at me all the time. And sometimes it wasn't what I wrote, it's one of my reporters. But I think what I liken it to is whatever my writing style is, it's kind of like having a child. And you can't tell your child, be more like this, be more like that. You just have to accept what your voice is. And so, so that's been my long-term process.
All right, so we have just a couple of minutes left. Susan, we had one request earlier for this salad dressing recipe. You can share, maybe.
So, sure.
Maybe.
How can I, Mary Elizabeth, if I give it to you, can we?
Yeah. If you give it to me, we can give it to people who get their copies of When Can We Go Back to America.
Well, so you have to understand the way my mother is one of those. She doesn't follow recipes, and she never measured anything, and it all turned out wonderful and delicious. And so when people would ask her for her, how can I learn how to do that? It was hard. Not that she didn't want to share. It's just that she, this recipe may not have any measurements. So, but I'm
intuitive cook.
Yeah.
Got it. Sharon shared a comment. Just a comment, thinking about the next generation following the immigrants in most Asian families. Rochelle Cruz's poem, Maximum 25 Words, comes to mind. So I don't know if you all are familiar with that. Margie says, to Naomi, congratulations on Clark and Division. I've read and enjoyed all your novels. Clark and Division is excellent, a great blend of history and mystery. I hope it's a great crossover success for you. We had one additional question, which you've touched on a little from Arlene, which was, what did you each learn about yourselves in the process of working on these books that are so connected to you in so many ways?
Well, for me, I've been working on trying to learn more about my family history ever since I was a high school student. So there's a lot of parallel in terms of the work that I've done in the community and trying to understand more about my own family stories and records. And what I have found is that the process of whatever I learned about my family history has helped, influenced and helped educate me in what I teach in the course and what went into the book, and the research that I've done for the course and for the book has also informed what I've been able to learn more about from my family history. And so I think that's an aspect for my students at USC, no matter what their family backgrounds are, that's been very motivating for them, that they then turn to thinking about what their own family immigration stories were, or learning more about their relatives, either living or their ancestors. I think that the element of surprise in the research. I was working on the course materials and a few years back, and I was just Googling things. And I remember the article when it came out, and it was when the redress checks were starting to be issued for the oldest surviving, the then oldest surviving Issei. And my dad's oldest sister, so my Auntie Tomi, my dad's oldest sister's mother-in-law, so my uncle's mother, was in her 90s at that point. I remember her well. And there was a LA Times article that had my Auntie Tomi facing the camera, and it was them presenting the check to the grandmother that I remember on my in-law side. And the article was about her receiving the check and what she was going to do with it, and that sort of thing. And I remembered seeing it at the time, or my mother sent me a clipping of it. And then I was Googling things one night and hit that article. And as the computers was loading on the computer screen, I saw the article, I saw this photo of my aunt and her mother-in-law, that Obachan, feeding on my computer screen. And that was just such a great moment, that I was reconnecting with that story and reconnecting with that part of my dad's family. Just things like that would come up and would be very meaningful.
I think for me, I was scared to death to write Clarkin Division, because I actually have really no personal connection. This is kind of the opposite, aside from me interviewing and talking to people all these years. So, but that it's possible that I can write a historical, and I really enjoyed it, and I'm planning to do more.
So thank you all so much. Feel free to turn your cameras on to say goodnight to our authors. And thank you again, Susan and Naomi.
Kristen, hello. So great to see some familiar faces.
Yes, it's been too long. It's been way too long. Stay safe, everybody.